Welcome to a Parallel Project Training, APM Project Management Qualification podcast based on the APM Body of Knowledge 7th edition. You should be using this in conjunction with our e-learning, podcasts, and potentially a tutor-led course. For more information, please visit www.parallelprojecttraining.com.
Welcome to another Parallel Project Training podcast. This is based on the Body of Knowledge 7th edition. My name is Michelle Greaves and I'm joined today by Paul Neighbour.
Hello everyone.
Hi Paul, how are you doing today?
Yeah, really good.
Good. And today we're going to talk to you about scheduling and resource management. So we've got quite a few sections of the syllabus here. So the learning assessment criteria that we're going to cover are including ways in which to create and maintain a schedule, looking at some of the differences between critical path and critical chain, and also then looking into resource categorisation in those two different life cycles, so linear and iterative life cycle. And that will allow us to talk about resource levelling and smoothing, which is another assessment criteria. And we're going to finish off with cost planning, again in iterative and linear life cycles. So it probably makes sense for us, Paul, to start with creating and maintaining a schedule. But let's start with the creating part. So how do you go about creating a schedule in a project that you're working on?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Where does scheduling start and scope management finish, really, isn't it?
I think lots of people get confused between a scope and a schedule what the differences are.
Why do you think they're confused?
I think lots of people look at scheduling as being everything that we're doing, and they encompass their scope within that, which it kind of is.
Yeah.
But what would you say the key difference is?
Well, for me, the end point of scope management is when you've got that work breakdown structure. So you've defined all the products that you're going to produce and all the work required to create them. So that's what I call a scope baseline. We'll talk about agile techniques in a minute. So how do we then work out the time it's going to take to deliver all that work? So that's where scheduling kicks in for me. So what I'll do is create a schedule. So there's several steps here. So should we start at the beginning and work through them?
Yeah, so scheduling's a bit more about the time and the scope's the what. So we've got the what. So what do you then do?
So the first step quite often is to break the work packages into a little bit more detail. So you might have, a work package is create a report. But we all know that to create a report, there's quite often sub-steps or activities people refer to that write the report, draft the report, get all the comments back.
Make all the changes.
So writing the report is sort of like a big bucket really that contains lots of activities. So that's the first step, is to really understand what's in that work package. And then break that work package down. And then we need to understand the dependencies, the linkages between the different pieces of work.
Yeah.
And so that can give us a precedence diagram, so in the dependencies. And then from there we can do some analysis of that, either critical path or critical chain analysis, to work out what's the overall duration.
Yeah.
If we're doing an agile approach, we can do that in sort of steps, so we can do it at a bit at a time.
Yeah.
And then having agreed that, we end up with a baseline schedule, which is an agreed plan that we're all going to work to.
This is quite often what people see as the Gantt chart at the end, that sort of horizontal bar chart. Most people have perhaps
And I think a lot of people just jump straight to the Gantt chart, don't they?
Absolutely.
They go, like, I'm just going to draw this in Excel.
Yeah.
They miss out the steps of decomposing the work package and then working out all those dependencies and those links, or breaking it into time box stages, as in Agile.
So that's kind of introduced us to how we get to a schedule. But how do we then maintain it? So you mentioned there baselining. So,
yes.
So what's a baseline?
So a baseline is the agreed plan that we're going to work to. So basically we go back to the sponsor and we agree these are the timelines that I'm going to deliver you. And this is what you will get in that timeline. To then maintain it, we need some form of control cycle. So we need to measure what we've done each week, each month, each day, whatever, and compare that back to the plan, tick off what we've done, recognise what we've not done, and then take any corrective action that we need to try and keep us on plan, really.
And we can baseline in lots of different ways. You tend to baseline on costs is quite a common one.
I mean, classically, there's 3 baselines: cost, schedule, and scope. And then other people add. I like to see requirements as well, but the classic 3 triangle, the old triangular balance.
Yeah, that's great. So what about critical path and critical chain then? So a new area of the syllabus here is the introduction of critical chain.
Yeah.
So I don't know how you want to do this, Paul. Do you want to talk about the 2 separately and then
Let's
the
talk about
differences?
critical path first.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about how you finesse that with critical chain.
Okay.
So critical path, you build that precedence diagram built on dependencies, and there's different types of dependencies. Should we go through those now, or should we leave them for... You can read about those.
It's quite a lot of detail, and perhaps on the e-learning you'll be able to see visually a little bit more about how
it's quite hard to explain that without
path.
a picture. So basically there are different types of dependencies: starts and finishes, whatever. So you can build that dependency, and then you can work out the sort of duration of the project from start to end. When you talk about dependency, we're usually talking about, let's do a really simple. I'm building a foundation, I'm going to put a wall, and I'm going to put a roof on. So they're technical dependencies. And usually we don't take much account of resources in drawing up those dependency networks.
Yeah.
If you think about when critical path was invented, it was the Apollo space program, it was DuPont, it was the Second World War. So resources weren't as constrained as they are now.
It's quite helpful on something that, like you say, is quite construction based.
Yes.
We've got to wait for the foundations to set before we move on.
That's right.
But in a lot of industries now, we're working on things that are more software related,
That's
more
right.
project and policy related, and the people then are more dependent than perhaps the tasks.
And that's what critical chain tries to address. So it recognises that you might have two tasks, let's call them A and B, that are running in parallel. But in today's organisations where we've downsized and we're quite lean and keen, if the same person is working on those 2 tasks, they can't do 2 things at once.
Yeah.
So there might not be a technical dependency between them, but there's a resource dependency.
Okay.
So critical chain refers to the resource dependency, so that they'll start task A, and when they've finished task A, they'll move on to task B.
Yeah.
So we can't do those 2 in parallel because we don't have the spare resource to do those things in parallel. So it builds on the theory of constraints. So I don't know if you heard of the theory of constraints. So the theory of constraints says there's a key constraining resource in every organisation, and if you schedule your work around that key constraint, then you'll get the best out of that organisation. So my critical resource is the one that's got no spare capacity. So I schedule all that work around that critical resource. And anything else that feeds that critical resource, I put some, what they call a buffer or some float, some feed, so that everybody else is getting everything ready for that critical resource. So that critical resource never stops or never has to wait.
Yes, it's much more focused on them getting the job done in as quick a time as possible.
Yeah, it puts resources first and technical dependencies last. There's one other little bit that's in critical chain, is to do with who owns the contingency. So say I came to you, you work for me, and I said, how long will it take to write that report? And you say, it'll take me 20 days. In your head, you're thinking 15, but I need a bit of contingency. So who should own that contingency? Should it be you as the person writing the report, or should it be the project manager? So the critical chain approach shares that contingency. So that's everybody put their contingency in the pot, and we'll share that amongst everybody. So it instead of targeting on the safe dates, it targets on the most likely finish dates. So the same as 3-point estimating, we use the most likely date. So that we chip out all the little contingencies, all the little tasks. We put that what they call a contingency buffer at the end, project buffer. So you might have an earlier finish date than planned, which is where people criticise critical chain, because they say, well, if you can finish early, you'd finish early. So my customer sees so
the customer might see that end date as the actual end date.
That's right. Why have you got 5 days of float? on the end of your project.
Whereas in critical path, the float tends to be focused on each activity.
That's right.
So someone may say, oh, I've got 20 days to do this task, so they don't start it for a couple of days, and
That's right.
you lose your time.
That's right. So there's
the
other behaviour things like they really want a work ethic. So they have this baton passing philosophy that as soon as you get something on the critical chain, you pass it on as fast as possible. So you pass on early finishes. So as soon as you get the baton, you start running with it because you're aiming. So it's much tighter. So we used it at my last company. It was really successful for, it's good for R&D, resource-intensive work, software development, that sort of stuff. It's been a bit overtaken by more agile and time boxing type approaches.
Which kind of probably leads us into starting to think about iterative life cycles. So just
Yes.
kind of moving us on a bit, we've got how we allocate resources in linear and iterative life cycles. So I think we've kind of started to touch on that, because once you've got your critical path or your critical chain, you're assigning the people to those tasks
Yes.
as you go. So how do you kind of
So we could do
differentiate?
should we do the same again then? Should we do the classical resource
Yeah.
allocation, and then we'll talk about the time boxing approaches and critical chain approaches? So classically, you take your Gantt chart, you work through your Gantt chart, you say how many people do I need to do each of these tasks in the time. You add them all together, and that gives you a resource histogram or resource profile. And then you go, oh my gosh, I haven't got enough people. So then there's a couple of technical things you can do. Smoothing, basically, where you say, if I've got float on a task that's over allocated, I can use some of that float to try and overcome the resource constraint. Leveling, where you say, well, what I'll do, I'll let the project float out as late as possible and so that nobody works any overtime. So any resource allocations get swamped up by time. So basically saying this isn't a time critical project, this is a resource critical critical project.
Yeah, so smoothing tends to get called, isn't it, time limited scheduling,
That's
and
right.
levelling is resource limited
Exactly.
scheduling. But you tend to do both of these on much more of your project planning software.
Yeah, so
scheduling
Microsoft
tools.
Project is sort of the classical way of doing that. There's other things you can do, like more practical things, like, I don't know, hiring in some agency staff, cutting the scope back, doing the project in phases, minimising the requirements. I often think halfway through a project you realise, oh my God, we haven't got enough resources, we haven't got enough time, let's just cut back to the bare minimum, what the techie people call minimum viable product. What's the minimum viable product we can launch to get this done.
But we tend to allocate people to the tasks in iterative life cycles. So we might use like a racy chart to assign
that's right.
assign people to different work packages.
Yes.
But in iterative life cycles, we kind of don't do
You
it
commit
that
it the other way, don't you? You say, how much resource am I prepared to commit to this project and how much time? And then you'll say, so what can I deliver for that resources? So it's really great for digital projects like websites or apps. So when we're doing our new websites, we'll say, right, we want to get it launched for Christmas. We've got 5 weeks left, 6 weeks left, 8 weeks left. What can we get done to hit that end date,
No, I've done this with a website in the past. So you get given a set of developers. Okay, well, you've got 3 developers over a 6-week period.
Yeah.
And that's your kind of your time allocation
And
your
it's
resources.
the other bit of the triangle. It varies. It's the scope bit that varies
That's right.
to fit the time and effort you've got available.
So how do we pick what bits we're going to do though in that time? So how do we?
So there's
prioritise
ways
it?
of prioritising them, aren't there? So there's various ways. Moscow is one of them. Must have, should have, could have. That's an easy way to understand it. I think there are other ways where people prioritise the requirements with user stories. What's the most essential user stories we need to deliver at this phase. There are some downsides with it. People tend to... You have to be careful you don't choose the easy stuff to do
Yes.
and put the hard stuff later.
Always put off the bottom of the to-do list.
Put off the bottom of the to-do list.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting. One of the clients we're working with now is talking about IT systems to implement primary and secondary legislation. So it's quite interesting because all the IT teams work in agile ways and the government set legislation. So it's quite an interesting balance. So you've got this hybrid really where you've got like high level requirements that have been set by law, by policy, and then iterative ways of delivering those. So so that can work.
And we've kind of talked about resources quite generically. Would it be helpful if we just kind of bottom out a little bit about what we mean by resources, because we can get different types of resources as well.
Okay. So you mean like human resources and...
So when we talk about resources, we tend to think about the people on
Yes.
projects, but it's not just about the people we might need. So
you've got plant as well, equipment. You've got materials sometimes. It's quite interesting, actually. Everyone assumes materials is not going to be a problem, but then you have a brick shortage or something.
Absolutely.
Or you can't buy servers, or long lead time components.
Yep.
Components that take, ordering from Japan and things like that take years and years to, months and months to deliver.
We assume there's always going to be petrol at the petrol stations.
Yeah, we
and
do.
then you get petrol crisis or shortages.
So Matt's just given us a piece of paper saying 15 minutes is up.
Perfect.
We're trying to keep these to 15 minutes. Anything else on your list we've not done
The only
yet?
thing we haven't done is cost planning. So
Cost planning. Okay,
So
so
we'll just
again, you've got the
finish
two approaches, really. The classical approach is where, having resourced all the schedule, and we know what the day rates is and all the material resources, we just add that all up, and that gives us a bottom-up or top-down cost for the whole project. With time boxing or agile approach, it's a bit easier, really, to cost plan, because you say we're going to spend 6 weeks and 3 people, and you get what you get, really. But the difficulty with that is, how do we achieve the full functionality? So how many cycles are we going to need to achieve the full specification?
And we've got to make sure we get our estimates right on that, because we might think it's going to take 6 weeks and it actually takes 8, and then we need to
but
get
they carry requirements for to the next wave.
Yeah.
So it is a bit more like emergent cost type arrangements, really, where you pay for the time and you get the most out of the time you can, really.
Do you think it's harder to go over budget in a hybrid sort of cost planning model when you're time boxing?
Depends on the function, how much flexibility you have in your functionality.
Yeah.
If you're in a tech startup and you need to get a minimum viable product out on the market, then time to market is the most important thing. So budget's not that important.
Yeah.
If you're implementing a piece of primary legislation, then you've got to deliver the full functionality to support the legislation. So that's a whole podcast in itself, isn't it? Good.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast and found it informative. To find out about our training courses, e-learning or tutor-led course, please go to www.parallelprojecttraining.com.